bit older than babies. One group I'm particularly proud of at the moment are our youth kids. Okay, so they've been meeting on Friday nights. There's between 15 and 18 of them coming here, and they're an awesome group of young people, and we're going through Youth Alpha at the moment. Now, Michael, I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot, but do you remember the video the other day? What happened when old mate walked up with he said, "Hey, I've got a free ice cream cone for you. Here you go." What did the other guy do?
He smashed on the ground and said it was too good to be true.
Yes, thank you. He smashed it on the ground and said, "That's too good to be true," and he stormed off, right? Because they're doing a series on the gospel and what it means for Jesus to pour out his grace. And essentially, it is too good to be true. It causes us to ask questions. And so the youth are doing Youth Alpha. Be praying for them, because there's like between 15 and 18 of them, sort of that size, just getting kind of discipled and reintroduced to Jesus. It's going really well. But there's a lot of social experiments going on at the moment, especially on YouTube with different influencers, around things being too good to be true. In our house, we watched two guys, one Mr. Beast and another guy Unspeakable. Anyway, Mr. Beast got $1 million in $100 notes and attached them to a tree and made a money tree. Okay, these guys, it'll make you, I don't know if it'll make you enchained or like jealous or inspired or whatever, but these are young people like 19 who have started these YouTube channels that have blown up, and they literally just have millions of dollars to do stuff with. It's really ridiculous. Mr. Beast gets $1 million worth of $100 notes, puts them on a tree, and just leaves it. And anyone who, like anyone's allowed to touch it, right, and take it, and there'll be no repercussions. There's no signs or anything. And hundreds of people run past this without even taking a $100 note. Now you might think, of course, there was no sign saying free money. You can't take the $100 off the money tree. Should we have like a little poll? Who would have taken some money off the money tree? Just eyebrow poll, so I don't see your yeah, I see a few eyebrows moving, right? So maybe you wouldn't take Mr. Beast's $100, but this other guy, Unspeakable, what he did is he set up a stand and had like iPhones for sale for $1, like, you know, up to a few $1,000 items for sale for $1. And you could only pay $1. You couldn't offer to pay $50, you had to pay $1. And so the first people would walk past and he says, "Hey man, do you want an iPhone for $1? And just walk off like he's up to something, like suspicious as. And then the next group was like a little bit salty that he'd even interrupted them. "Don't talk to us." You know, and then so there's this whole table full, and then eventually some willing people come up and go, "Is there a catch?" "No catch. $1. And they give him $1, and he hands over like an Xbox or something too good to be true, and they just go, "Thanks," and walk away. No strings attached. Funnily enough, it was just as COVID started, so there was all these iPhones and things for sale for $1, but then a thing of toilet paper for sale for $50. So I thought it was good, right? But everyone was like, "What's the catch? This is too good to be true. This doesn't make sense. Why are you doing this?" We actually get to a place in Romans 3 where the people who have been listening to Paul speak in Romans are asking similar questions. What's the catch? You know, what's the deal? You're saying that it is by grace that I'm saved and it's too good to be true. What's going on? What's the real deal? What's the catch? What's the fine print? Surely there's more to the story. And that's where we find ourselves in Romans 3. See, when we actually come down to the real gospel of Jesus Christ, it's too good to be true and there's no catch. And we struggle living in a place where we can accept that it is that good. Sometimes we can be like the skeptical people who think there's got to be more to the story. There's no way you're selling me an iPhone for $1 and there's not something I have to do in return. Or surely I owe you. Or I'm going to be on a mailing list and you're going to bombard me and get more money back out of me in the long run. And Paul's saying, nah. There is no catch. And so if you did a bit of homework and read Romans 3 in advance, what you would have noticed is that there's this question and answer kind of formula that goes through Romans 3. You know, it's as if Paul is anticipating the answers of the imagined reader. Did you catch that? The whole heap of them. It sort of starts like, in verse 1, it's like Paul, the question to Paul is, are you saying that there's no advantage in biblical religion? And he says, no, I'm not saying that. There's great value in having and knowing the words of God, right? That's sort of his answer. And then the reply is, yeah, okay, but those words have failed, haven't they? because so many haven't believed. So what happened to the promises of God? Do you know what I mean? It's like this back and forth between the anticipated receiver and Paul. And then Paul answers, well, despite his people failing to believe, God's promises are still advancing. Our faithlessness only reveals how committed God is. Like in verse 3 and 4 there, see that? There's like a dialogue happening. Remember that Romans is written like a courtroom experience. Okay, that's why we've got a gavel here that we don't hit enough. But it's written like a courtroom, and at the moment it's almost like the defendant and the other one. Sorry, it escaped me. Who's the other one? Prosecutor. That they're against each other trying to figure out what's just. You know. The question is, okay, then if unrighteousness is necessary for God's righteousness to be seen, how is it fair then for God to judge us? They're the anticipated questions when it's too good to be true, right? And then the answer is, on that basis, God would not judge anyone in the world, and then we agree that all should not be judged, is what Paul would reply. But then they'd say, well then if sinning makes God look good, then why should I not just keep sinning anyway, knowing that righteousness is coming? And then Paul says, well, I've been accused of teaching that, but I don't believe that at all. Right? And so we don't continue to sin so that righteousness will increase, because then we've missed the fundamentals of the gospel. And so this question and answer, I think, that we see all through Romans is actually revealing the heart of humans when we just can't believe that it is true. It's too good to be true. We get the answer. If you can go to verse 21 there for a sec for me, please, Malika. So it's a couple of slides along. So there's all these questions that come and go. Now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. Now please, if you're thinking, Dave, I've heard the gospel, I became a Christian years ago, this is old news to me. This should never become old news to us. There's a righteousness that is imputed to us simply because we believe in Jesus Christ. Now, if at the moment you're thinking, but, then you're adding to the gospel. That's the end of the gospel. When it seems too good to be true, we start saying things like the anticipated questions. Oh, well then why don't I just keep sinning so grace will increase? Wrong question. That's not going to happen if you've actually understood the gospel. Or what about those who X, Y, Z? The gospel of Jesus Christ is that righteousness, right standing before God is given to all who believe. Are you an all? All who believe. But then, what about my speech? You know, it's crass. Yeah, that's part of your sanctification, but you're still being given righteousness. All right, but what about these addictions that haven't broken off yet? Yes, that's part of your sanctification, but it's not to do with imputed righteousness. What Paul's trying to deal with us at our core level is the idea that we find it very difficult to believe that it is no strings attached. All through Romans so far, what we've been dealing with are two groups of people who are trying to handle this truth, this revelation, unhealthily in their separate ways. Remember last week, Don talked about that there are the legalists and the licentious. There's those that think that they're saved by their obedience to the law, and those that think, well, because the law's been solved, I can live any way I like, right? And they're one of the two responses, and she mentioned the parable of the prodigal son. You know, in the parable of the prodigal son, the one person who gets rebuked more than anybody else is the big brother, right? Why did the big brother get angry? Do you remember?
Yeah.
Why?
Because he didn't get celebrated for anything.
Yeah, he didn't get celebrated. He's like, you know what? This young brother, he's been off gallivanting. Well, I've been here being the good boy. And he comes back and you slayed a fatted calf for him. What have you done for me lately? Do you know what I mean? He thinks that his righteousness is built somehow on his works before the Father. And then the Father says, look, you've always been with me, son, but this guy was gone and he came back. Do you know, I don't think that in our particular church we struggle too much with being the younger son, or that's not a temptation that we might have. But maybe the older son might be something that could sneak into our thinking, right? You know, I've been so faithful for years, God. Why are bad things happening? You know, God, haven't you seen how I've served you? Can't you just X, Y, Z? And it gets reduced to a formula instead of what God's done through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Go back to the one before, please, bro. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile. Verse 22, verse 23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. You know, one of the best things that I've ever done was go to Jerusalem last year with Jess. But maybe not for the reasons you would expect. You know, for some reason I thought, okay, we're going to Jerusalem. Like, this is where it all happened. I figured there'd be some sort of moment where we'd fall on our knees and finally be home, right? Now, it was spectacular. It was a fantastic learning opportunity. It was brilliant to see the footsteps where Jesus himself had walked. But what I realized is that all the same issues that we have here in the West and in Australia are exactly the same issues that they have in Jerusalem too. You know, they've got they've got the legalists, the people trying to get into salvation by their own works. They've got the humanists, those who don't even believe that there is a God, even though they live in Jerusalem and most people are religious. You know, they've got the anarchists who are ready to start some sort of revolution in God's name, whichever God that is. They've got the hedonists that are just living for themselves. I mean, Tel Aviv looks exactly like the Gold Coast. You know, the same debauchery, the same everything, same nightclubs, same scantily clad people, it's all the same. They've even got the worst of all, the cyclists, like we do. Legalists, humanists, anarchists, cyclists. Cyclists, is there a cyclist in the place? Stop wearing spandex in public, you shouldn't do it. And all of these people need to be justified freely by grace. See this, there's no Jew or Gentile, there's no racial entrance straight into the kingdom. God's not more impressed with the Jews than he is with the Gentiles, as we see here. What they have in as an advantage is the heritage of knowing God. And as verse 1 says, is there no advantage in having the law? Well, Paul says, yeah, there's an advantage. You've got the words of Christ, but unless you live that out, well, what point is that? Verse 25. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. Now that is another sermon series in and of itself, but essentially what that passage seems to be alluding to is that people who died before Christ have do you want to say a holding room? I mean, I don't know if you guys want to go there. Can that be your homework, just to figure that passage out? But basically it's this idea that, okay, it's like grace in advance. These people knew, the Israelites knew Jesus was coming. There was a coming Messiah, and somehow that's appropriated retrospectively. That's all I'm going to say. You figure that out. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and to be the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Just and justifies. And it's only about Christ. The more I do this, the more I get confronted, because for me, Christianity can become so kind of like, this is how we do it. But when we've got the gospel of Jesus Christ, that it can actually take us to where God has intended us to be. God has called you to be the fullest version of you through the gospel of Jesus Christ. He's not calling you to look like me, sound like me, or anyone else in this room. He's calling you to be you. Not to be a cookie cutter type Christian where we all look the same, talk the same, agree on everything. I mean, I think the fundamentals need to be there, right? Jesus is Jesus. He's the way to salvation. But we don't have to have every single tiny little thing exactly the same for us to be family. That's a cult. That's not church. right? And what God's calling you to be is to be the fullest version of yourself in the gospel of Jesus Christ. The question is, are you free because of the gospel of Jesus Christ? Free to be yourself. Not to excuse any unhelpful habits. God is going to take those away with the power of sanctification. But free to start where it's Jesus. Setting my life free from all burden, all condemnation, too good to be true, and then we go from there. If you don't know, maybe think about how you share the gospel. What's your gospel message? Is your gospel message that it is by grace alone for all who believe? Or is there conditions to that grace? Is it like you have to do X, Y, Z before you're a Christian? Do you know what I mean? What Paul's doing here is sifting out understanding of the unconditional gift that cannot be earned. When you have a little chat to the people around you, ask each other, are you free? Are you free to be yourself? Now, introverts, don't worry, I'm completely aware of being married to an introvert that just right now you wish you didn't come to church, right? You have no obligation to talk to anyone. If people gather around and you say, no thanks, you're free to say no thanks, okay? Ask each other, I'll give you 5 minutes, are you free to be 100% you? Who knows this legend? Roz, you know this legend. Who really knows him? This is Clint James. Clint, are you free now?
Getting there.
So what's it like? What's your world and why are you getting there? How's that work?
Before I was scared to say I was a Christian, just through judgment and stuff like that. And just basically come to a place where I feel that God loves me and God thinks I'm cool, and yeah, if you don't think I'm cool, and it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. You know, and where did that come about? How did that come about for you?
Brad praying for me one day when I was struggling with what I needed to do for God.
Yeah.
To love me, am I enough? And Brad was praying with me and just told me, he said, God thinks you're enough, you're a son.
Yeah. So thanks mate, great to see you. You know, once we have that revelation, we don't need affirmation from humans anymore. We like it, we're not reliant on it. Clint's very words, well God, what do I have to do for you to love me? Nothing. Like, we're bound up by this kind of thinking. That's the big brother. What do I have to do, God? I've done all this for you. Isn't there some sort of transaction that happens? No. Performance does not matter. You know, it doesn't matter. God's not looking at you, loving you more or less, depending on your output, your capacity, your ministry. This passage says it is a gift for all who believe. It's literally belief that enters you into the kingdom, nothing more. Belief. Our natural inclination is to push back, saying, well, what about obedience? Yeah, that's important, but it's not the gospel. What about this? What about that? Yeah, all of that's important, but when we start at a fundamental level, if we don't get this foundation right, everything else is skewed. Everything else is broken. You're enough because of what Jesus has done.